Good morning, everybody. Excellencies, distinguished guests and colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very happy to welcome you this morning to the first high-level conference on strengthening multilateralism through science. It's co-organized by the United Nations Environment Programme and the Czech Presidency of the Council of the European Union. And welcome to those of you who are here in the room with us at UN House, and also to the many online participants joining us from around the world. My name is Sherry Aldis, and I have the honor of moderating this first session, the high-level political panel on science diplomacy. I'm the director of the UN Regional Information Center here in Brussels, where we look after UN communications for 22 countries and in 13 languages. Over the course of the next 2 days, we'll have speakers with us from various international and EU institutions, representatives of member states, of civil society, academia, and youth. This conference is organized in the context of two very important milestones: the 50th anniversary of the UN Environment Programme that took place in February this year and was celebrated at the UN Environment Assembly, and also the Stockholm Plus 50 conference in June. I think that we're all aware that we are facing a triple and self-inflicted planetary crisis: climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. We're at a tipping point where we desperately need to improve our relationship with nature and where science's relationship to policy is more crucial than ever. The UN Secretary General's recommendations for a common agenda of action to accelerate the implementation of existing agreements, and especially the Sustainable Development Goals, stress the importance of science in many areas. A few examples: science as a global public good, and also as a means to find new ways of measuring progress instead of the very restrictive GDP that is no longer fit for purpose. Science to help countries deliver on concrete policies and actions that are aligned with a net zero future. And science, facts, truth, and reliable information as a way to combat the rampant mis- and disinformation that we all encounter in our online interactions, and that threaten public support for the implementation of impactful climate and even other policies. As the Secretary General says, we need to make lying wrong again, and we need to end the war on science. It has real-world consequences, and we at the UN are working intensely to prevent and combat it. In my area of work at the Department of Global Communications, we're working on a global code of conduct for the integrity of public information that will support and defend empirically backed consensus around facts, science, and knowledge. As you all know, at the UN, we produce and disseminate vast quantities of scientific research to inform policymakers and the general public. Last year, UNEP published its first synthesis report called Making Peace with Nature. And as the Secretary General said during its launch, without nature's help, we will not thrive or even survive. Joining efforts with the UN and the EU, the Norwegian Ministry of Climate and Environment, the scientific community, and other partners, UNEP calls for tackling this triple planetary crisis. We're now going to show you a short and I think very inspiring video that captures some of the key messages from Making Peace with Nature, and I think sets the stage really well for our conversation today. These transitions are always challenging. I'm sure it will happen, and it's worth it. now we have some practical information I'd like to share with you on today's session. We're here together until about 11:15. We started a bit late, and apologies for that. So we might run over a little bit, but let's try and keep to that timing. We'll start with some opening remarks online and in person. And the participants that are online, I would encourage you to use the chat function to please ask your questions. You can even share your email addresses just in case we don't get to the questions that you ask. We will try and address some of the questions from the visitors online as well as the people in the room. But given the timing, probably not all of them. The session is being live streamed and recorded, and for communication purposes, we will be taking photographs in the room. So if you do not wish the photograph to be used, please let us know either now or at the break so we can take that into account. At today's session, we're going to examine the relationship between science and policy. A stronger science policy interface can inform the effectiveness of multilateral actions needed to address the global challenges that we're facing today. Science can make multilateral institutions fit for the challenges of the 21st century. And as I mentioned before, the UN Secretary General's Common Agenda is calling for science-based policy actions and stronger multilateralism to deliver the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. So we'll be discussing these issues and others today from the perspectives of diplomats, decision makers, and politicians. So it is now my pleasure to introduce to you our 6 distinguished panelists. We have to my right, Mr. Jan Duzik, the Deputy Minister of the Environment from the Czech Republic. We have Ms. Irene Kitty from the Foreign Service Office, the Kenya Embassy to the Kingdom of Belgium. She is representing His Excellency Batange Ndemo, Kenya's ambassador to the Kingdom of Belgium, who had to unexpectedly step into another meeting. So thank you, Irene, for being with us today. We have Ms. Joanna Drake, the Deputy Directorate General for Research and Innovation in the European Commission. We don't have Mr. Javi Lopez, but we do have Mr. Peter Kaiser, who is the Special Envoy for Science Diplomacy at the Czech Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We also have Andrea Hinwood, who is the Chief Scientist at UNEP. And online, we have Mr. Dan du Toit, who is the Deputy Director General of International Cooperation and Resources in the Department of Science and Innovation for the Republic of South Africa. So thank you to all of you for being here. And it is now my honor to introduce online Ms. Inger Andersen, the Executive Director of the United Nations Environment Program. Unfortunately, she can't be here in person today. As I'm sure you all know, there's the first meeting of the very important Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee on the new Treaty on Plastic Pollution taking place in Uruguay. So she has recorded a video message for us.
Ministers, Excellencies, distinguished guests, welcome to today's conference on strengthening multilateralism through science, co-hosted by UNEP and the Czech Presidency of the Council of the European Union. My thanks to the Czech Presidency for its efforts on multilateralism and for co-hosting this event. I can't be with you in person as I am in Uruguay at the first meeting of the Intergovernmental Committee to develop an internationally legally binding instrument to end plastic pollution. This milestone decision taken by UN member states at UNEP 5.2 this year in March is a great example of how science informs multilateralism and compels nations to act. The recently concluded climate COP in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, also demonstrated how science is integral to multilateralism. Yes, the outcome was a mixed bag. The language of 1.5 degrees and ending fossil fuels was weak, or non-existent actually, but we did see history made with a loss and damage fund. Yet without science, we wouldn't be having these discussions at all. We would be scratching our heads wondering why the climate has gone haywire and have no idea about what to do. We do know what to do, thanks to reports like UNEP's Emissions Gap Report and the Adaptation Gap Report, which was cited in the Sharm el-Sheikh Implementation Plan. The same applies to the upcoming Biodiversity COP, COP15, at which nations must agree an ambitious new framework to protect biodiversity. Science identifies the problem and gives us the solutions. But for all that science has achieved, the triple planetary crisis of climate change, nature and biodiversity loss, and pollution and waste is accelerating. We are far behind on cutting emissions, far behind on protecting and restoring nature, and far behind on ending pollution and waste streams that poison both people and planet. The question before you, therefore, is how science can make multilateral systems move faster and harder in the direction of solutions-focused action. Please allow me to offer my thoughts in 3 areas. The first area is to make science more transparent, more understandable, more actionable, and yes, more accessible. Everyone is busy. The people we most want to influence are not experts on the environment. So we need simple messages that focus on what policymakers, the private sector, investors, and individual consumers can do, rather than what they haven't done. There is a payoff to well-communicated science. When the world discovered the impact of lead on children's health and communicated it, everyone listened. We now have no leaded fuel, and this prevents 1.2 million premature deaths each year. The second area that I want to highlight is to improve the science policy interface. We need to work across disciplines to accelerate how science drives effective policy change, regulatory change, or law-based changes. We need to streamline knowledge production so that we narrow the time lag between what the science tells us and us taking action through policies, which we know, frankly, today is far too slow and far too long. Science must also be proactive, which is a key focus of UNEP's work, of course. Crucially, science should also be more inclusive. Diversity in science allows us to meld ideas and deliver solutions that work in different society and settings. We must use every piece of knowledge, from respected scientists to indigenous women to bright young youth. All voices need to be heard. And the third area that I want to highlight is to use technology wisely. The data revolution, advanced analytics, and AI have helped scientists better understand the impact of climate change. Green technological advances make it more feasible for policymakers and the public to imagine shifting transportation and energy systems. And in fact, in many parts of the world, science has helped to reduce emissions. But we need more of this, with one eye on the potential negative impacts of any new technology and the other on the future. And we should also start thinking of nature as a key solution space. Let's face it, nature cools, nature filters, nature protects us against storms, and so much more. All things we do try to do with technology, when perhaps we could just lean on nature. Friends, today's conference in Brussels, the birthplace of the European Green Deal, provides an important opportunity to discuss actions in these areas and more. It provides a chance to focus on science that doesn't just warn, but delivers change through multilateralism and beyond. I look forward to hearing about your recommendations, and thank you for allowing me to speak today.
We enjoyed it. We'd like to welcome Javi Lopez, who's just joined us, member of the European Parliament. Thank you for being here with us. And I think that we have a second video now from Mr. Jiří Kozák, the first Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Czech Republic.
Distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. First, I wish to thank the organizers for conveying this timely event and for inviting me. I would also like to give greetings from the Czech Foreign Minister Jan Lipavský. Unfortunately, neither of us was able to take part in person. Therefore, let me share a few thoughts in this virtual way. Although science and diplomacy are two different disciplines, there is a value in learning from each other. There are foreign policy fields where learning from research and development and reacting to its trends is needed and helpful. Science, technology, and innovations have been a driver of global change. Perhaps the ongoing digital revolution shows this trend most visibly. Innovations transform the foreign policy landscape rather dramatically. Diplomacy reacts to these trends, and not only in terms of security policy. Science and innovation diplomats foster, for instance, high-tech defense cooperation or exchange of researchers. This in turn boosts the competitiveness of our countries in the global arena. Speaking of competitiveness, diplomacy and science are also intersecting in the field of economic diplomacy, where the search for international cooperation in a high value-added sector is increasingly important. As the overall theme of this conference highlights, science is also the key to delivering the Sustainable Development Goals. Achieving the 2030 Agenda for the Sustainable Development also requires evidence-based knowledge of efficiency of the adopted measures. Last but not least, I would like to emphasize the use of scientific data and models in anticipating and predicting natural disasters. Disaster risk reduction in relation to fragility and climate security has been one of the topics of the Czech EU Presidency. We have succeeded in drafting and just yesterday endorsing Council conclusions on the role of DRR in EU external action. Let me add my personal take on the COP27 climate conference in Sharm el-Sheikh, where I had the opportunity to take opening part alongside the Czech Prime Minister Petr Fiala. I have witnessed a repeated highlight of the need for resilience building and a real implementation of solutions for fragile countries and regions. I trust that strong multilateral cooperation backed by science can be one of the answers to this powerful call. Not only in this respect, I would like to emphasize the critical role of young scientists who need to be engaged in tackling the big challenges of the humanity. Ladies and gentlemen, let me stop here and wish you a productive exchange of ideas.
Thank you. And now I would like to turn to Mr. Jan Dužić, the Deputy Minister for the Environment from the Czech Republic, who's representing the Czech Presidency of the EU Council with us today.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone here and online. And we are happy to contribute with co-organizing this event to the celebration of the 50 years from Stockholm Plus 50 and also the 50 years of UNEP. And we see how our challenges have evolved and how they have become increasingly complex. And now that, as Inger Andersen confirmed, we need to connect the three crises together and find solutions which can address those three crises: climate, biodiversity, and pollution at the same time. And there are other crises, of course, which are coming into the play and which we need to address at the same time, and with less and less time available. The European Union has the ambitious program of the EU Green Deal, which takes that holistic approach. And we, as the Czech Presidency of the EU, have been busy with pursuing the legislation and policies throughout our program, and we will still be busy for several more weeks. And this is a program that will run further as the legislative proposals are being presented. And one part of addressing those interconnected challenges is taking science, taking innovation on board, using the potential of the digital technologies and other environmental technologies to help us overcome those combined challenges. So this is very much part of what we are trying to embrace. In the history of global environmental policy and in present, we have a number of good examples of how science is influencing and how the interconnections are being made thanks to science. I would start with the Kigali Amendment of the Montreal Protocol, which evolves from addressing the issue of ozone layer protection to addressing the climate footprint. Then the nature-based solutions, which we are trying to implant in between the discussions under the Climate Convention and the Biodiversity Convention, are another example. We are trying to advance the agenda of nature restoration, which will be an important point in the Montreal Conference on biodiversity, but also domestically at the European Union level. And as Inger Andersen is currently in Uruguay for the plastic negotiations, again, this is something which has been based on a solid scientific assessment that is now moving into hopefully becoming a new treaty. Science is also important in holding policy to account, and this is where the importance of bodies such as IPCC or IPBS, and newly also the science policy panel on chemicals, waste, and pollution prevention, are able to watch the progress, how the policy is doing in relation to scientific findings. And if we look at climate and the work of IPCC, as we have just come out of COP27, we see that we need all the solutions. We need the smart solutions in order to speed up the transition in view of the current also geopolitical challenges. So really, this interconnection is must be even stronger than before. In doing that, we also need to see how we can engage with the universities and with the students who will be professionals of tomorrow. In view of the transformations that are needed, we need to see how the curricula for education can be adjusted for addressing the future or emerging challenges. That's why also in Sharm el-Sheikh at COP27, the Czech presidency together with Romania organized a high-level panel on climate education. And it is a good point in case about the complexity of the challenges that need to be understood by the young generations. And let me finish with pointing to the need of translating science to wide public. And, in view of the disinformation and misinformation, this is again more important than ever that we are not only able to produce a high quality science, but also to be able to convey that science to people so that they can grasp, they can understand what is their role and what is the role of the policies that we are trying to design. So I'm looking forward to today's debate and wish us all a productive day.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So to start with, I'm going to ask each speaker on the panel to share a short statement on the general theme of the conference from their organization's point of view, about 3 minutes each. And so really to look at, from your organizational perspectives, what is the role of science diplomacy in closing the gap between science and its policy uptake? So I'll turn first to Joanna Drake from the European Commission, if I may.
Thank you very much, Sherry, and thank you for this invitation to this very timely debate or conversation. I think we talk about multilateralism having to be strengthened via science. Why? Because I think we're all acknowledging the subtext, and the subtext is that multilateralism is very much threatened. And it's one of those things that we cannot take for granted anymore. And I think UNEP here has quite a lot to teach us, if you like, because you have very much been at the forefront of diplomacy and also of science for 50 years. At the time, of course, I mean, the timing is all wrong, you know, for this to be happening, that multilateralism is wafer thin in terms of, you know, how resilient is it. At the time when we need to be even more joined up for global challenges, and we all know what those are, whether it's climate change or biodiversity or pollution or the pandemic or the energy crisis. I think we need more systemic responses to these challenges, and of course that means that science itself is usually the vector of evidence-based, shall we say, facts that should be really be channeled through at the right time, the time when the two politicians. And therefore, while we do acknowledge that science diplomacy would be the right channel, the right means to provide the evidence for foreign policy, at the same time, we know that this is not something that to be taken for granted. We also know, and all the speakers before me have said that, you know, science is also there to provide the solutions and to provide the shall we say, the alternatives, to the world that as we know now, to the things as we see them being panned out now. At the same time, we need the infrastructure, we need the ambience, we need the environment, we need all the ecosystem, for that to take off. And again, this is not to be taken for granted. How do you make, all this, first of all, accessible? All the speakers mentioned the importance of having science accessible, meaning that it has to reach different communities and not the communities that understand science necessarily. And I'm talking also the communities who, as we heard very much in COP27, are the ones that are the most vulnerable, maybe without their own fault, but at the same time, who are not actually thinking first thing in the morning, of how they are going to solve the climate issues, because they're thinking about how they're going to survive and how they're going to bring up a family. So how do we reach those people as well? I think this is a big gap that we need to also disentangle via science and via the help of other sciences, if we like, and other solutions as well. On the other hand, so while science is there, we know it's there, we need to work on it more in terms of, at what point does it influence politicians? How does it treat politicians and policymakers? But more importantly, how does it empower people on the ground to lead a better life as well, and to reconcile, their life with the calamities happening around them? On the other hand, we're also saying through this, science diplomacy is good. It's good news, but it also implies that both foreign policy, multilateralism, and science itself need to also get out of the comfort zone. So that is, I think, the glaring gap that we all need to work better at. What does this mean? It means that if we're really serious about this, we really need to make a big effort about how is it reflected in governance, for instance. How is science reflected in, let's say, easily understandable economic benefits as well, of the alternative means of how we get to the better solutions to make peace with nature. Now, I say all this against, of course, I come from the European Commission, and we all know that the European Union is very much wishing even more. I mean, first of all, it has taken very much the lead in these global challenges, especially the environmental ones, but not only, and is a big believer and actor of multilateralism, but at the same time wants to even more leverage its not only convening power, but also itself as a global powerhouse in this regard. And it has issued some communications which are, wanting to show to the world that this is what it wants to do more of. And I mentioned here the communication on strengthening the EU's contribution to rules-based multilateralism, and also the Commission which adopted the global approach to research and innovation, for instance, because we have acknowledged thereby that science has a really central role, take the central role in the global approach to research, but the global approach to solving global issues as well. But of course, this will not change the mindset of governance and how countries and regions collaborate and also make it happen. So this is why I'm suggesting that both science and diplomacy need to get out of the comfort zones to make the real difference on the ground.
Thank you. And Irene Kitty from the University.
Thank you. Just to bring back on what I was just shared, from a country perspective, we're seeing a lot of science diplomacy informing national development agendas, and we are having whereby when we refer to the IPCC report, we're seeing a lot of our climate change agenda being informed by the report and the recommendations that are coming out of these global conferences. And in order for us to bridge this science diplomacy gap, we are finding that we're having a challenge in the implementation aspect of it. And the role of science now comes in ensuring that there is a systemic format whereby it informs categorically based on the different realities. On the global south and the global north, the realities very vary, and that is a fact. So when it comes to the general reports that are provided, they don't categorically go down to the grassroots of which region, which continent is being impacted by the alarming or glaring impacts of climate change. And if we could utilize science to come up with a very specific report or analysis that will be able to categorically inform countries on how best to link their national agendas and initiatives so that they can be able to categorically tackle the issues that are at hand in their countries. And also through that, maybe we'll be able to see how, because a lot of these climate change conferences, there's loss of trust. And science has been playing a very critical role in bridging that trust. And because it's factual, it's not diplomacy in terms of I'm coming here based on my interest. This is science informing the climate change conferences, the biodiversity conferences, UNEP conferences. So through science, we'll be able to utilize to inform our national agendas and be able to also see how best to move forward through action. And another thing that Kenya has seen science bringing out is to bring out more vibrantly the role of interconnectivity through science and technology, because science cannot be implemented in silos from technology. As we now familiarize ourselves with the EU Green Deal, we're seeing a lot of interconnectivity between the renewable energy, green economy, and how we can leverage on technology to be able to realize that. So science will be able to also bring out the connectivity on how best science can be informed and supported by technology. I think also we have seen a lot of SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, have not been realized, and we're 8 years to, is it 7 years now, to being able to attain the 2030 agenda. And some like this, SDG 14 is the least funded Sustainable Development Goal, which if we could utilize science, because ideally the SDGs are supposed to be supporting each other complement each other in the realization. And if we could leverage on science to be able to identify the gaps that are linked leading to this stalling behind in the realization, then we'll be able to move forward in attaining the full realization. I think that will be my point on the role of science.
Thank you, Irene. I'll turn to Mr. Javi Lopez next.
Well, thank you very much. First of all, it's a pleasure to be here, trying to discuss how to use science in our policies, and especially how science is related to multilateralism. No? I think we agree about the challenges that we have are nowadays multidimensional, interconnected, and with a huge capacity. Which complexity, and we need a huge capacity of coordination to face the challenges, climate change, climate, biodiversity, pollution, food security, health crisis, some of them. And obviously we need multilateral order working and for coordination and with a technical and scientific approach. No, this is the first thesis I think we can share, and we need capacity to deliver, and for that we need science diplomacy and scientific cooperation. I will add, in a world of now fragmented under competition, science could be a common ground. In a world that we don't have a lot of common grounds, to be honest. We have some good news, the last 10 years of good examples of a scientific multilateral approach to our problems. 2030, the Agenda for Sustainable Development, obviously organized by United Nations and the international community committed. This is like try to deliver solutions to a complex problems with a scientific approach, and also the Paris Agreement. It's also two good examples of good practices that we have. No, But not only this, I will add, like, we have good news and bad news. No, it's true that COVID-19, it was a tragedy, obviously, but at the same time, moved science to the center of the political attention, and this is also a reality that we can use. But also we have bad news, I would say, about science, because like we have to discuss about something, because we are all agree that science approach is important. And the point is the limits of science in politics. And this is a reality, the rise of populism, the emergence of anti-science politics, the proliferation of disinformation and conspiracy theories. The point is science policy approach, politics approach, it's a product of the rationality and the enlightenment. And also rational approach has limits to politics. And to be aware about that, it's the first step, I think, to try to maximize science approach that we needed. Modernity, it's felt for a lot of people as a golden cage. It's not my case, but I think a lot of things that are happening in the population and in our public opinion is out of rational approach. The will of belonging, for example. I don't feel it, to be honest, personally, but these things are there. And if we want to defend science in our public conversation, we also should be aware about the limit of science in politics, because also it's there. Well, it was one of the big discussions during the 20th century, to be honest. Some things that we can do. Scientific institutions, strong and trusted with technical agencies and that tackle complex crises and with shared views, inclusive views, and secondly, the key role of multilateral fora. I think one of the main messages how science needs multilateralism and how multilateralism needs science, you know, to face the great challenge. Three last message. I would say problems of communication, but they are more complex than problems of communication. I would say, like, try to focus on the benefits, on the awareness, and try to be aware about the limits of this science approach. Secondly, to maximize, you know, the science approach. Secondly, the institutions and bodies are extremely important because it's easier to trust. Like, you don't trust like the message. You usually trust the messenger, the people who is sending the message. It's like it's difficult to understand what the doctor is telling to you. Important point is like if you trust the doctor. And third, more inclusive multilateralism. Like multilateralism needs a reconstruction. This is something that's clear. The crisis of influence and effectivity, it's there, and the reconstruction of multilateralism, I'm sure, will help the science approach that we need for face all the big challenges.
Thank you. I'd like to turn to Dan du Toit, who is joining us online, I believe from South Africa.
That's correct.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me clearly?
Absolutely.
Yes. Thank you indeed for inviting me to participate in this very important session. After so many informative views from the other speakers, there's hardly anything new I could add, but I will try and offer a South African perspective and 3 points I would like to make. Firstly, about why this meeting is so important. Secondly, on how we seek to address the gap between science and policy uptake in South Africa, and then some recommendations on how we can reinforce the interface between science as an instrument for multilateralism. Now, certainly multilateralism is one of the tenets of South Africa's foreign policy. mean, we are firmly committed to multilateralism. It's also because of multilateralism that we today enjoy democracy in South Africa. And therefore, we are very concerned. As other speakers have mentioned, the increased geopolitical tension, the real polarization we witness is putting multilateralism and global solidarity under threat. So therefore, and gatherings such as this, which can consider on how we can strengthen and reinforce multilateralism, we can only welcome. And we do believe science can play a crucial role to do that, because science is a universal language. Science seeks to unite, science doesn't divide, and science brings people and countries together. So the topic is very topical and relevant, also because we believe that science is an instrument. It's a critical tool for development. It's not a reward for development. But I also want to make the point that even as we speak about the role of science to strengthen multilateralism, we shouldn't forget that science also needs multilateralism. We also need multilateralism to strengthen science. I mean, throughout history, throughout humanity's history, science has always progressed when we work together, when we share experience, when we share expertise. And therefore, we believe that weakened multilateralism also puts science under threat and puts under threat the scientific progress we need to respond to climate change, to respond to pandemic disease, to respond to food security. So therefore, my congratulations and thanks to UNEP and the Czech Presidency for organizing this very important discussion. The gap between science and policy is probably as long as the history, a perennial challenge, as long as the history of science. And we do believe that the COVID-19 pandemic put that really stark into the spotlight. And I think offered us, as the earlier speaker said, some good success stories, some valuable lessons on how to seek to close that gap, and also pointing to some of the challenges which still remain. Now, we speak about science advice for policy, we speak about science diplomacy, and for people like myself who live in the bureaucratic space of science policy, those are some of our famous buzzwords, jargon. We always have to be very careful of buzzwords and jargon because we sometimes mean different things with it. But I'm saying that because I'm going to respond with another policy buzzword and jargon, and something we firmly believe that is absolutely crucial to close this gap between science and policy, and that is a commitment to open science and real open science, because we think the key characteristics of open science allows us to close that gap. And of course, what is open science? It's in the first instance open access, greater access to research results and the translation of those research results in a manner so that they can become useful tools and information products to inform policy making. But it's not only open access, it's also open data. If COVID-19 taught us anything in South Africa, it's how important it was to have access to a robust data infrastructure across all spheres of public policy making for data to inform our policy and decision making. But we often also forget that open science is not only open access and open data, but it's also open to society. And that's where science diplomacy has to be sensitive, as other speakers have said, has to be informed, has to be shaped, and has to be guided by the concerns of society. We cannot have, just as science cannot be in an ivory tower, science diplomacy cannot also just be a pursuit for those of us who are in the corridors of the United Nations and other multilateral bodies, but it has to be an enterprise which is sensitive to and engage society and engages society, specifically civil society, as an active partner. So to conclude, we believe strongly that it's important for us to work together to reinforce the interface, the partnership between science and diplomacy in support of science for policy making. And we believe there are three key investment areas, and others have mentioned this. Firstly, infrastructure, and I'm specifically speaking of digital infrastructure, which is so crucial to underpin our access to data as a tool for policy and decision making. Secondly, as others have said, investment in people. We need to train both the next generation of scientists and the next generation of diplomats to be sensitive to this crucial mission to have science diplomacy impact policy making. And Then lastly, and perhaps most importantly of all, is investment in trust. It's investment in confidence building. And that is one of our biggest worries in South Africa, is that we believe that in many parts of the world, we've stopped listening to each other. So that recommitment to listening, to dialogue and engagement will be absolutely crucial for us to reinforce multilateralism. Thank you.
Thank you. Peter Kaiser, I think this is a perfect introduction to perhaps what you might want to say about how science diplomacy can influence international affairs and support international collaboration in a very divisive environment that we're living in.
Thank you very much. And actually, it's a very honor and pleasure for me to be at the panel with so many distinguished speakers. And I really appreciate the discussion of today. I think it's obvious that it's a very important issue that we are actually analyzing together. When speaking about science diplomacy from a perspective of a practitioner, I consider myself as a career diplomat practitioner. I think we usually think about two major domains of science diplomacy. One of those being promotion of international collaboration in science to achieve excellence in research, to promote the development of technologies. And at the same time, science being used, scientific evidence being used as a tool or a basis for international negotiations to address our common challenges, for example, in the area of climate change, environment protection, so forth. Obviously, there are some people who actually raise questions: what is the role of science diplomacy today? Renewed rivalities, new rivalities arising with, I would say, international multilateral system under stress. Let's put it this way. Whether we should rethink the concept itself. My point would be that we need science diplomacy even more than ever. Because obviously, science diplomacy is not going to address all the, for example, security related issues, but this is the most effective instrument to address the common challenges like environmental protection or climate change. Much has been said already about this scientific evidence by previous speakers, and I think this is really the key issue. The key issue is not whether we should use science as an instrument for debates and negotiations in international fora. The issue is, I believe, the messaging between the scientists and the diplomats. What is necessary is to have a clear-cut messages for those who sit behind the negotiation table. What are the building blocks of future possible solution, of future possible agreement? And there's been obviously many good examples mentioned already today. For example, the language on 1.5 Celsius threshold that should not be exceeded in order to avoid worst case scenarios and other messages. But honestly, sometimes the scientific evidence provided for the diplomats in general terms is of rather technical nature. It's very difficult for people outside the scientific community to relate to their lives and to their objectives. So because in international fora, not only science but the politics comes into play. So I think it's important for the scientists to, as it has been said already, to leave their comfort zone and to be much more straightforward vis-a-vis the diplomats. But having said that, at the same time, I believe the diplomats should be much more attentive to the researchers. Must be much more willing to work together. And how to do that? I think it's important to understand science diplomacy as a very important, legitimate tool of foreign policy, as a tool that should be integrated into foreign policies. And I have to actually acknowledge that in the European Union recently there was adopted a decision, a global approach to science diplomacy, as has been referred to by Deputy Director General Drake, that European Union is willing to utilize science diplomacy, including the evidence-based science-based evidence for promoting our global goals and our global policies. Now we are actually within the European Union, we are discussing how to translate this decision into concrete actions, how, for example, the EU institutions should work better and closer together with member states, what we can do in terms of capacity building in diplomacy, how we should develop the curricula, training the diplomats and so forth. I think it's a very important exercise, and actually it happens that the coordinator of this exercise is with us today. And I would like to share that I have sensed a lot of, I would say, optimism or a lot of determination to really move this agenda forward, because there is a genuine shared opinion that science diplomacy indeed is the agenda for diplomats to develop, to integrate more into our everyday life, because this is the really effective tool to address our global objectives. And so from my point of view, this is the right moment for us to discuss the future of science diplomacy from both perspectives, not only what the researcher should do more for this diplomats, but how the diplomacy should better deliver on this strategy. That would be my point. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm just mindful of time, so I would like to shift the agenda around a little bit, if I may, and hopefully we'll cover some more of the ground that we wanted to through the questions to the panelists. But I'd really like to open the floor to people in the room, and then if we have time, to people online as well for questions that you might have for the panel. Yes. Would you please introduce yourself briefly?
Thank you very much. And I see we have a common mission here with regards to the SDGs. My name is Ilias Grampas, and I'm working at the Secretariat of the European Parliament Intergroup on Climate Change, Biodiversity and Sustainable Development. So I couldn't agree more with your points on the fact that we need to make lying wrong again. And for that, we need science-based solutions. We need nature-based solutions where research and innovation have a key role to play. Of course, we need a multi-stakeholder approach, and we need well-informed and science-based policy making for that. So I don't mean to step on the narrative of the event, but since we're talking about science and diplomacy, I was just wondering if speakers might be interested in reflecting a bit on lessons learned from COP27.
Thank you. Can we take another question maybe, and then we can come back to that? Other questions? Online, are there questions? Gentile? Okay, so why don't we look at that then? So lessons learned from COP. Who would like to address that?
I can say a few comments, as I was as I had the privilege or duty to lead the EU coordination in COP27, and busy with the negotiations and with finding the common ground. I think it was mentioned here that. And Inger Andersen said it herself, that we were hoping that science would be brought more on board in the COP. And my perspective, again from the EU side, was that we were leaning too much on the points on the agenda regarding the loss and damage and creation of a new fund with a capital F, which was the result in the end. And I think I agree it's an important step forward, and the loss and damage is something which we need to take very seriously and address it with resources. But at the same time, as much attention as we put on adaptation, loss and damage technologies, we will not succeed if we can't stop emitting CO2 and greenhouse gases in general. And in that sense, the IPCC is unequivocal in what's the state, what are the prospects, what are the needs that we need to take. And I think that we all have a collective homework to do better than we did in Sharm el-Sheikh for the next climate conference.
Thank you. So we do have a couple of questions from online that I would address to the panel. The first is, how can we foster capacity building at the science diplomacy interface? And the second is, can you talk about the role of climate science communication for ensuring its accessibility, and what is the role of civil society in this regard? Who would like to step at that? Marlene, I'm wondering if you might want to look at the capacity building. You were talking about the implementation, how we really need science for implementation.
Actually, I was raising my hand to respond to that. This is a very good question, because we could be speaking, but then when it goes to the implementation aspect of it, that's where the gap is very huge. And how do we foster capacity building? It all goes back to partnerships. And partnerships are also very closely interlinked with multilateralism. So there's a lot of, because science diplomacy also involves the role of the academias, the role of students. The intergenerational equity now comes into play, because we have to equip them for them to be able to carry forward what will be put in place to be able to serve the current planet. So capacity building requires now a holistic approach to be undertaken. That is the academias partnering with schools, partnering with the multilateral development banks, because they're already on the grounds engaging the grassroots level. Multilateral development banks like World Bank, they've been there since time, and they've been able to work very closely with people at the communities, and they're able to explain the gaps that are already happening on the grounds. So when we employ a multi-stakeholder approach in building capacity, we will be able to achieve a lot. And also the financial support has to also be met, because we cannot be able to transition to employing science when there's already a gap in providing technical capacity, and that which requires funding and training. So I think the whole multi-stakeholder approach needs to be employed for us to be able to build capacity. Thank you.
May I on this one? Actually, again, from a very practical point of view of a practitioner, I think there are several areas regarding capacity building from the perspective of, for example, career diplomats. I think there are important elements in this process. One of them being obviously education, and to think how for our future and younger diplomats, how we can ensure that they are very well educated in the area such as environment protection, science diplomacy, and so on and so forth. Second, I believe it's important that prior to deployment of the diplomats to, for example, international bodies like UN, it's important to provide the necessary training and necessary team building with researchers that might be then supporting them in the delegations in the international environment. So I think it's really about investing into the people. Second, I believe it has been said by previous speakers as well. We live in an area of digital diplomacy and digital communications. So I think we need to be much more active in messaging outside as diplomats, as researchers, prior to the negotiation, then interpreting what has actually happened, because not everything that is in the media as headlines is actually the very substance of the outcome. So, and coming back to the previous question in this perspective, I think what we should do, what is the lessons learned from the meeting in Egypt, I think we should be focused on our issues. And I have some experience from the United Nations, and sometimes we have to actually see through that our priorities will in the end go through. Sometimes it takes, unfortunately, too much time, and obviously in the area of climate change, the time factor is of critical importance, but we should not shy away from our priorities, and we should really do our utmost to see them through, to redouble our efforts. I think this is the lessons learned. And coming back to the capacity building, this is a common task of the researchers, community and the diplomatic community. And actually, I think we should not forget about another important stakeholder, which is the broader public. Because the public is very important. We cannot achieve any breakthrough unless we are getting the support from the public. This is what I meant when I said the science evidence is important, though in negotiations the politics come into play, and the politics is influenced by the broader public. So I think it's very important.
Which ties into that second question about the importance of climate science communication, right? You need that public support, you need civil society support in order to be able to actually implement policy. Yes.
I mean, I would like to comment on a number of points that have been raised, and also to your question. First of all, I mean, I'm not an expert on climate, and definitely I'm not a climate scientist. But I think one lesson that I saw from afar, from COP27, is that whereas it's true, it's frustrating that the science did not take center stage, to make very strategic and serious decisions together. I think it was also a problem about the solutions that science offers in terms of alternative solutions that were not put at the center either. I mean, take the case of renewables. Why do we not talk about alternatives to for renewable energy, for instance, in that context, when we know that, first of all, there's an obligation at the global level. We need to go from 28% to 89%, I think, by 2050. How are we going to do that? And why are we not making that also a strategic objective of the talks? And I think this sort of shifts also the train of thought, rather than just on the science of, which is important, very important. But I think you also you also would change the dynamics if you also talk about, okay, what's the alternative and how are we going to make it happen? Of course, the fund is important, but also how we're going to do the alternative way. I think in terms of how we're going to build capacity. Again, are we serious about it? We can do multitude of partnerships, and I can quote a number of partnerships that the EU has done, especially DG R&I, Research and Innovation, the DG I come from. I mean, if I mention just one of them, the one in the Mediterranean region, it's great, because it enhances trust. You put, Europe, let's say the Prima example, the platform on research and innovation in the Mediterranean area. I mean, it puts the Middle East, Europe and the African countries on the same footing, and therefore you engender trust, and you use this common language that was being mentioned. But is that enough? Wouldn't we be far better off if the governments were really serious about building the next generation in terms of skills, in terms of dedication, in terms of vision, in terms of ambition, that skills for about climate, about the science of how we make peace with nature in biodiversity in our local regional context is taught as we learn mathematics at school. I think it was Barcelona, Catalonia, that has been, they recently announced that they have an obligatory module about climate science from very early ages as part of the educational system. It's integrated in the education system. I think that's really going serious. And also in terms of communication, is very important. I think it's true that when I said we have to get out of the comfort zones, not only do we need diplomats that are more scientific and scientists that also know how to reach the diplomatic world and also to communicate to those who are less scientific in their mindset. But I think it's a little bit more than that. I think there's no better message than actually showing how an alternative behavior could be in line with these obligations, and also whetting the appetite from an early stage of young people who are much, much more committed, I think, than maybe people in my generation and maybe a bit younger than myself are, by then actually creating also economic prospects, job prospects, skills prospects, that they themselves are the architects of the solution themselves. So, they are the scientists and they are the diplomats at the same time, and they're actually living it. And I think this is what we need to aim for. Now, how serious are we? Do we really have a plan? at national level. We might have it at a global level for cutting emissions, for renewable energy, for biodiversity, which is all commendable and all necessary, because that's the global framework. And you need to have scientists and diplomats in the same room, but we have to live it. And we have to create a real opportunity on the ground. And this is when the shift actually happens.
Thank you. So again, mindful of the time that we have, we would like to have some conclusions, I think, it's very important that we do have a moment to sort of wrap things up. And then I think that we also need a 5-minute break before the next panel starts, and that's actually at 11:30. So if you're ready, Andrea, I would like to pass the floor to you to see how you can wrap this up.
Okay, so thank you to the organisers and the Czech Presidency for the opportunity to sit on this panel. You probably can't see my notes, but I've got lots of notes because there's an awful lot to take away from the discussion already. But there are a couple of key things, and I'll leave what I think is really key to last. But I want to address this issue of integration. We've talked about the COP27 on climate. We've talked about the biodiversity COP coming up. We've got the INC for plastics on foot. We've got an open-ended working group with regard to chemicals, waste and pollution. All of those issues are interrelated, and science can actually help us integrate those, which then we get to the question of addressing the SDGs. That gets to the next summary point, which many of the panelists made, which is I'm calling it the science of solutions. But basically, with that integration needs to be coupled with the science of solutions, and that then deals with the issue of communication of science. I guess we've always used the language that science is of no benefit if no one understands what you're actually talking about. And that means from your diplomats, your civil society, etc. So we need to actually get much more sophisticated in the way that we communicate science, and that's not dumbing it down, that's actually creating the products which will actually resonate with people where they live and in the communities that they serve. So integration, the science of solutions, science communication, I think I've heard from my esteemed panel here. I do want to talk about science as a unifier, which was also outlined with respect to multilateralism. And I think that our example with the INC for plastics actually shows that science was a very strong predeterminant of that INC for plastics. And without the science, we wouldn't have got it, but we have multilateralism at play in actually negotiating that treaty. And I think it's a great example of how science can be a unifier. And I've always said, people have said, how can you do this role as a chief scientist? Well, actually, it's probably the safe space because in many ways, you're actually working at that interface. And it's where you can actually discuss what you know, what you don't know, what you need to do with a framework. And again, if you couple that with communication, then that's a great space. I've got lots of other things about the translation. The summary is on open, accessible, transparent science in UNEP's view, and I think from our panel as well, is an absolute must, coupled with understanding the uncertainties and the way you actually communicate those uncertainties of the information to the audiences that need it. So I'll leave in the interest of time. My last point is that science is optimistic. Actually, what I've heard here is because science is providing solutions and opportunities, etc., we actually have an opportunity here to talk about science in terms of the future and the positive actions that we can take. If we can have done all of these activities to create the environmental damage that we've created, we certainly have the wherewithal to actually address those issues. And I've heard a degree of optimism about both how science can help multilateralism, but how it can actually help us solve these problems. So I'd like to leave on that positive note, because I actually think it is. And I think if we employ tools to use that, that's a great space to be in. Thank you.
Thank you. Good to end on a positive note. Absolutely. And
thank you. I agree with much of what Andrea said. I'll just add two reflections. One is on the interface between multilateralism and diplomacy and science. I think that was mentioned that we still need more effort to get out of the comfort zones of each and speak to each other, to to create a better understanding that can help in rebuilding the trust. And we are in complicated geopolitical times today, and building the trust and strengthening what multilateralism can achieve is important. And in that, science can be an instrument if properly embraced by the diplomats, and if we can bring the messages across. And the second one is about the people, and obviously all the politicians are dependent on being elected, and for that they need to have the trust of people, and people need to understand what are the solutions, why are these solutions being put forward. Javi mentioned the COVID-19 and trusting the doctors. I think this is really a good example of, okay, so if I know what's good for me, if I'm convinced that this is the right path, and if the politicians and diplomats act in the way that actually puts forward the recipes towards healing the patient, this is something which can work, and which is essential for making those solutions, rather than jumping on quick populist solutions which are ill-founded and meant to derail the mainstream solutions. I think this is essential, and there is a real danger that is growing, and the science has the kind of obligation to stand on the right side of history and help with finding the right solutions for the complex world. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, so we certainly have time for a coffee break, which I think will be good news to everybody. So thank you to all of the distinguished panelists. I very much appreciate your presence here today. To our online participants, our in-person participants, and my wonderful colleagues who have really worked hard to organize the interesting and stimulating discussion today. I hope that you have some important takeaways. I think that it's good to have this opportunity to confront these different perspectives in very constructive. So I will invite you all to take a short break until 11:30, when we'll have the next session on science and global cooperation that will be moderated by my colleague Veronica Frankova. So thank you very much, everybody.
Ministers, Excellencies, distinguished guests, welcome to today's conference on strengthening multilateralism through science, co-hosted by UNEP and the Czech Presidency of the Council of the European Union. My thanks to the Czech Presidency for its efforts on multilateralism and for co-hosting this event. I can't be with you in person as I am in Uruguay at the first meeting of the Intergovernmental Committee to develop an internationally legally binding instrument to end plastic pollution. This milestone decision taken by UN member states at UNEP 5.2 this year in March is a great example of how science informs multilateralism and compels nations to act. The recently concluded climate COP in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, also demonstrated how science is integral to multilateralism. Yes, the outcome was a mixed bag. The language of 1.5 degrees and ending fossil fuels was weak, or non-existent actually, but we did see history made with a loss and damage fund. Yet without science, we wouldn't be having these discussions at all. We would be scratching our heads wondering why the climate has gone haywire and have no idea about what to do. We do know what to do, thanks to reports like UNEP's Emissions Gap Report and the Adaptation Gap Report, which was cited in the Sharm el-Sheikh Implementation Plan. The same applies to the upcoming Biodiversity COP, COP15, at which nations must agree an ambitious new framework to protect biodiversity. Science identifies the problem and gives us the solutions. But for all that science has achieved, the triple planetary crisis of climate change, nature and biodiversity loss, and pollution and waste is accelerating. We are far behind on cutting emissions, far behind on protecting and restoring nature, and far behind on ending pollution and waste streams that poison both people and planet. The question before you, therefore, is how science can make multilateral systems move faster and harder in the direction of solutions-focused action. Please allow me to offer my thoughts in 3 areas. The first area is to make science more transparent, more understandable, more actionable, and yes, more accessible. Everyone is busy. The people we most want to influence are not experts on the environment. So we need simple messages that focus on what policymakers, the private sector, investors, and individual consumers can do, rather than what they haven't done. There is a payoff to well-communicated science. When the world discovered the impact of lead on children's health and communicated it, everyone listened. We now have no leaded fuel, and this prevents 1.2 million premature deaths each year. The second area that I want to highlight is to improve the science policy interface. We need to work across disciplines to accelerate how science drives effective policy change, regulatory change, or law-based changes. We need to streamline knowledge production so that we narrow the time lag between what the science tells us and us taking action through policies, which we know, frankly, today is far too slow and far too long. Science must also be proactive, which is a key focus of UNEP's work, of course. Crucially, science should also be more inclusive. Diversity in science allows us to meld ideas and deliver solutions that work in different society and settings. We must use every piece of knowledge, from respected scientists to indigenous women to bright young youth. All voices need to be heard. And the third area that I want to highlight is to use technology wisely. The data revolution, advanced analytics, and AI have helped scientists better understand the impact of climate change. Green technological advances make it more feasible for policymakers and the public to imagine shifting transportation and energy systems. And in fact, in many parts of the world, science has helped to reduce emissions. But we need more of this, with one eye on the potential negative impacts of any new technology and the other on the future. And we should also start thinking of nature as a key solution space. Let's face it, nature cools, nature filters, nature protects us against storms, and so much more. All things we do try to do with technology, when perhaps we could just lean on nature. Friends, today's conference in Brussels, the birthplace of the European Green Deal, provides an important opportunity to discuss actions in these areas and more. It provides a chance to focus on science that doesn't just warn, but delivers change through multilateralism and beyond. I look forward to hearing about your recommendations, and thank you for allowing me to speak today.
Distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. First, I wish to thank the organizers for conveying this timely event and for inviting me. I would also like to give greetings from the Czech Foreign Minister Jan Lipavský. Unfortunately, neither of us was able to take part in person. Therefore, let me share a few thoughts in this virtual way. Although science and diplomacy are two different disciplines, there is a value in learning from each other. There are foreign policy fields where learning from research and development and reacting to its trends is needed and helpful. Science, technology, and innovations have been a driver of global change. Perhaps the ongoing digital revolution shows this trend most visibly. Innovations transform the foreign policy landscape rather dramatically. Diplomacy reacts to these trends, and not only in terms of security policy. Science and innovation diplomats foster, for instance, high-tech defense cooperation or exchange of researchers. This in turn boosts the competitiveness of our countries in the global arena. Speaking of competitiveness, diplomacy and science are also intersecting in the field of economic diplomacy, where the search for international cooperation in a high value-added sector is increasingly important. As the overall theme of this conference highlights, science is also the key to delivering the Sustainable Development Goals. Achieving the 2030 Agenda for the Sustainable Development also requires evidence-based knowledge of efficiency of the adopted measures. Last but not least, I would like to emphasize the use of scientific data and models in anticipating and predicting natural disasters. Disaster risk reduction in relation to fragility and climate security has been one of the topics of the Czech EU Presidency. We have succeeded in drafting and just yesterday endorsing Council conclusions on the role of DRR in EU external action. Let me add my personal take on the COP27 climate conference in Sharm el-Sheikh, where I had the opportunity to take opening part alongside the Czech Prime Minister Petr Fiala. I have witnessed a repeated highlight of the need for resilience building and a real implementation of solutions for fragile countries and regions. I trust that strong multilateral cooperation backed by science can be one of the answers to this powerful call. Not only in this respect, I would like to emphasize the critical role of young scientists who need to be engaged in tackling the big challenges of the humanity. Ladies and gentlemen, let me stop here and wish you a productive exchange of ideas.
Second panel of the conference, Strengthening Multilateralism Through Science, that we kicked off with the session 1 that just finished, focusing on science and diplomacy and in politics in general. Now we are moving to the second session, which is equally exciting. It's science and global cooperation. Welcome to participants online. You can see that in the room we have a small number of people, but online we have, I think, about 71 people, I can see. So please, colleagues online, feel free to ask questions. We will be monitoring the questions and we will read out some of them. Otherwise, the housekeeping rules remain the same as for panel 1. So warm welcome to all and warm welcome for participants here in the UN House. The objectives of the session now is to discuss how we can strengthen effective global cooperation on science and research. And we have mixed speakers and mixed audience representing different international and European institutions, academic representatives, investment players, but financial institutions, and of course also youth. So we will discuss how to strengthen the cooperation to achieve progress on Agenda 2030 for sustainable development. And we will also look forward how to engage with the different stakeholders across the whole spectrum, how to work with academic institutions, academic community, and also how to leverage finance and investments informed on science. So this will be the setup for this panel. And it is my great pleasure to introduce the speakers who are here today. I will first introduce speakers in the room. So we have on my left, Stephen Quest, Director General of JRC, Joint Research Center, European Commission. we have Patrick Child, Deputy Director General of DG Environment, European Commission. We have Andrea Hinwood, Chief Scientist, that you met already in the first panel. We have Constance Kahn, Director of Sustainability and Quality Management Department at the European Investment Bank. And we have Hans Reinings, Executive Director of European Environment Agency. Online, we have Jian Liu, colleague from UNEP, Director of Science Division, and we also have Kathy Lee, UN Youth Advisor. So you can see that people have also the voice of youth on our panel. So, and we have Radka Vildová, also representing the Czech Presidency of the Council of the EU, but a different ministry. We heard from Ministry of Environment, we heard from Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and now we will hear from Radka also the point of view of research and education role. So warm welcome, Radka, as well. I hope you can hear and see us fine. We will start with two keynote speeches to set up the scene. And first, a keynote speech will be delivered online by Jian Liu. Jian is director of the science division, but he has over 30 years of professional experience in policy, science and policy, covering a wide range of topics throughout his career, environment, climate, ecosystem restoration, agriculture, but the list is very long. But he also was, still is, professor, so he also has research and academic background. So Jian, you will talk with us through the state of play of environment globally and also about the World Environment Situation Room. So Jian, over to you. Maybe there is a technical issue. Jian, we don't hear you yet. Colleagues are working on.
I'm sorry, I was muted. So that's why you didn't hear me. You can hear me now?
We can hear you well. And
right.
We don't see your presentation yet, so we can see it also. So you can go ahead.
All right. Thank you very much, Veronica. Good afternoon, colleagues and friends. Ladies and gentlemen, great pleasure to be here to share a few thoughts and examples on science and global cooperation. And actually, before I go to the next slide, let me just go back a little bit history about science, global science collaboration from the environment perspective. And let me start with the famous IGBP, the International Biosphere, Biosphere and IGBP, Global Biosphere and Global Geosphere and Biosphere Program, which is also in short a global change program. And that was back to 1980s. And that's really a truly global collaboration engaging thousands of scientists across the world. But that's also provided the basis for the establishment of the IPCC that was established by UNEP and WMO in 1988. So, and that's also truly intergovernmental, but also global collaboration of climate change related scientists all over the world. So pretty much that's the good examples of the global collaboration within the science community. Also, recently, UNEP actually has already initiated two respective initiatives to demonstrate how collaboration can be done on the sort of digital and data part, and to provide the sort of early warning services and to provide the data information knowledge for policymakers and decision makers. So that's the thing that we call it World Environment Situation Room, My colleague Andrea is there, so perhaps she could talk to you in person on details of this. Next slide, please. So basically, the platform is still in the early stage of development as a kind of federated data platform across UNEP. But we already started delivering services and products to member states. For example, with the support of the European Union and the government of Denmark, we were able to cover 60 countries to provide what we call the common country analysis. So that's a very typical example of how we use the data to provide the service on the environment aspect of a government decision-making process in those 60 developing countries. We are now at the stage of developing the second phase of the project to cover more developing countries and to upgrade the services and to enable environmental ministers and other stakeholders to make right decisions at early stage using this kind of data platform. Next slide, please. So talking about a global collaboration, here is the sort of example how we can use this platform to engage the science community, the policy community, and other stakeholders across the world, because each one of us, each one of you are both contributors to this platform, but also beneficiaries of this platform. Next slide, please. So another example is the report you might be aware called Making Peace with Nature. And this is a synthesis report that was released in February last year by the UN Secretary General, Mr. Guterres, and Ms. Inger Andersen, the Executive Director of UNEP. And this report was based on 25 global environment-related assessments, including those key findings of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Platform for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, Global Environmental Outlook, Global Biodiversity Outlook, Global Chemicals Outlook, etc., etc. So pretty much this is basically the effort that UNEP is trying to bring together the assessment community across the world on the environment to paint the big picture, and that's the basis. That's why now Inger has called this environmental crisis a triple planetary crisis: climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. Next slide, please. Okay, and basically, I'm not going into details of this report. You will find the report on the website of UNEP, unep.org. But this slide presents you the key point of the report. With this triple planetary crisis confronting us, we cannot continue transforming the nature, but we have to transform ourselves and transform our relationship with nature. And that's the key for a sustainable future. So that's the sort of conclusion of this synthesis report. So it's a kind of global efforts that, across the world with scientists from different disciplines. It's really multidisciplinary approach. But also this report will articulate also the roles of respective partners and stakeholders in making that turn, to transform our relationship with nature. Next, please. So this is a very good example. Talking about multilateralism, we reviewed many of these what do you call MEAs, multilateral environment agreements. And so basically we are going beyond the limits, be it on climate change, be it on biodiversity, be it on pollution, et cetera, et cetera. So, so that's the sort of slide I want to present it to you with this one. Thank you. Next, please. Okay, so the key message of this report was to transform humankind relationship with nature, and that's the key. So human knowledge, ingenuity, technology, and cooperation can transform societies and economies and secure a sustainable future. And this transformation will involve a foundational change in the technological, economic, and social organization of society, including worldviews, norms, values, and governance. And major shifts in investment and regulation are key to just and informed transformations that overcome inertia and opposition from vested interests. Next, please. So here's the slide. We're talking about the science and global collaboration. And under the umbrella of green transformation, the report articulated the respective roles of different stakeholders and players. And the governments at all levels must hold a lead role. And intergovernmental organizations like UNEP must facilitate this collaboration and joint efforts. And financial organizations must increase the direct investment, investments, and private sector to innovate and implement, and non-government organizations to conceive ideas and raise awareness, and individuals, households, civil society and youth groups, and indigenous peoples and local communities put their theory into practice. And then scientific and educational organizations develop knowledge and understanding. So pretty much this is a kind of part of the conclusions of this report on the roles of different stakeholders, talking about global cooperation. Next slide, please. Okay, that's the end of the slides, but I must say that in terms of global collaboration, in terms of science and policy interface, and I think the IPCC and UNFCCC relationship is a very good example. And the IPCC released first report in 1990 and 1992, the UNFCCC was established. And in 1995, the IPCC second assessment report was released. And in 1997, we got the Kyoto Protocol. And then through the third and fourth and fifth assessment, we got the Paris Agreement. Of course, in those processes, there are sort of unscientific forces intervening in the process. Otherwise, we would have gotten the Paris Agreement much earlier. But anyhow, we have the Paris Agreement. So you could see that this kind of science policy interactions, but also from the perspective of global collaboration, is a very good typical example, and also across MEAs and across scientific assessments, collaboration are happening. And UNEP is also facilitating a global, an ad hoc global assessment dialogue process, which brings together the global assessments and to achieve a sort of coherence and synergies across different aspects of those kind of assessments. I will just stop here. I hope I didn't exceed my time limit, 15 minutes. Thank you very much for your attention.
You have had also different hats. So currently you're Executive Director of European Environment Agency, but you have very rich and strong academic researcher background and also teaching environmental policy. and governance. So Hans, we are looking forward to hear from you about the state of the environment in Europe.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for the invitation to be here. And indeed, reporting on the state of Europe's environment is the key task of the European Environment Agency. That's why we were set up in 1994, and what we have been doing together with the member states and with scientists over the last 27 years. I think the subtitle here is what is at the moment really important. It's knowledge for action. And so the next slide, please. I also refer, when I talk about these issues, to the global assessment logic and the IPCC. Everybody knows that here very well. Climate emergency, IPBES, central to the COP in Montreal now, where we talk about the 6th great extinction, the first one that is caused by us and of which we could potentially be part. The one that is rarely mentioned is the IRP. It's the International Resource Panel, which actually talks about the unsustainable production and consumption systems that have impact on climate and biodiversity and on health, which is where the World Health Organization comes in. Europe is really important in all 4 of those. We're in the lead on the Global Resource Outlook for 24 that will go straight to UNEP. Yes, please. All 4 of these reports actually send the same message. And we're in a pivotal decade. We're dealing with irreversibilities, which is why we're talking about loss and damage. For example, we are seeing tipping points in natural systems, which I would claim also will lead to tipping points in social systems, because we lead in a socio-ecological system, and these things are interconnected. Now, this is a challenge for science, because science over the last 50 years has not exactly been set up to discuss knowledge in this context. So for me, this is the challenge. What type of science is it we will bring to the table? Next slide. Well, in the context that we are living in, these are just some pictures from Europe. Some people call it unexpected and exceptional. It's neither unexpected. Scientists have created maps that point exactly in this direction, and it will not be unexceptional, because this is the result of 1.2 degrees, and we're en route to 2.4 degrees if we don't drastically change direction. So that is the context for the scientific evidence that we are creating. By the way, we are doing the European assessment report of climate risks. We just did one on climate and health. So we are in the middle of those connected pieces of knowledge. Next slide, please. All of this is pointing in the direction of a system that is dealing with wicked problems. The word was mentioned already. And by definition, those are straddle organization and disciplinary boundaries. The one at 9 o'clock, solutions are not right or wrong, but better or worse. These are things that are sort of these. And by the way, this framework is from 1973. 1973. So we shouldn't think that we are reinventing or inventing something, which is really interesting. Built on this wicked problems issue, people like Ben Casho, who is now leading at the National University of Singapore, the center of reference in Asia on these systemic transitions, they've created this super wicked problems idea where time is running out, and that creates an urge for new knowledge. Policies discount the future irrationally. So how, as scientists and knowledge people, can we connect this future understanding to policymakers in a way that drives policies in a more rational way? Those seeking to solve the problem are also causing it. And I'll be a bit blunt when people say, what does that mean? I say, well, you can go to Davos every year, and partially that's where they meet, to be very blunt. But they also need to be part of the solution. So, I mean, this is a really sort of a strong governance conundrum, if you want to, and there is no central authority. So in that context, we try to come with knowledge together with European scientists, and Europe is the place in the world that invests most in this type of science through RTD and in the JRC, and then in the agencies and in the scientific community. Next slide. Okay, so what is very clear, and it's the central part of the European Green Deal, which is Europe's response to this context, is that we need to think more systemically and transitions. It literally says Europe needs to lead the transition. If I would go to the work program of the European Commission for next year, it has three central elements. The second one being we need to accelerate the radical innovation. Yeah. That is not boring administrative language. That's a call for action. And the third one is that we will never get there with business as usual. So we need to think out of the box. Yeah. So thinking about human well-being at the center, social cohesion, that's where the societal goals are. The outside shell are the planetary boundaries, which is actually a sort of representation of what people now know as donut economics, if I can make that link. Now, if you want to do that and think of transitions, which is not just a word, there is a body of knowledge underpinning that. We are indeed under very serious landscape pressures, climate change, biodiversity loss, the war in Ukraine, negative aspects of globalization with massive inequalities on this planet, to rethink these core systems. And traditionally, we've been focusing on science policy interface. Yeah? And honestly, I'm a lukewarm believer of that. Scientists don't speak to policymakers directly, and policymakers don't listen to scientists directly, which is where knowledge institutions come in. Organizations like ourselves, or UNEP partially, in some of its departments, that are set up to integrate the best science into an organized knowledge system that is set up to feed into policy processes. That is part of what we are doing. And then we will need to reconfigure the systems. The evolution of climate and environment policies over 50 years has been the first 3 decades, thou shalt pollute less. Yeah. Then the next 2 decades was you should become more efficient and optimize your systems, in the belief that by optimizing fundamentally unsustainable systems, they would become sustainable, which they're not. Yeah. And now the challenge is reinvent yourself within the boundary conditions of the 21st century, which is a very, very strong message coming from science and now embedded in policy making. Next slide. If we look at these systemic transitions, yeah, one click, we in policy, but also in science, focus a lot on the, I call it the intellectually pleasing green curve. We push for experimentation through R&I, we accelerate that through funding, then we institutionalize it, as the Green Deal is now doing very convincingly, and then we hope that we are stabilizing at a level of sustainability. But there is also the red arrow, and that is what we should be phasing out. Yeah. The issue is not that renewables are not breaking through, the issue that we're not phasing out fossil fuels. In fact, you can't even mention fossil fuels 30 years into climate negotiations, which is rather remarkable. Yeah? So the phasing out, yes, one click, which is where we will see conflicts. Why is my sector disappearing? Why are my subsidies disappearing? And where we will have to find enabling conditions. So speeding up and scaling up the green arrow, in our understanding, makes sense if you can also speed up and scale up the phasing out arrow. One more click, which is, and we know what this is, fossil fuels, although you can't mention it globally, environmentally harmful subsidies. OECD and the EU have been talking about that for 25 years, and we're still subsidizing fossil more than we are putting into a climate fund annually. Unsustainable taxes, unsustainable spatial planning, those are the things that we should be moving up. Yes, one more click. We have been integrating that in the SOER, the State and Outlook of the Environment Report, since we exist in Copenhagen. And if you do 3 more clicks, yes, 2, 3, fabulous technology beyond belief. We have been focusing more on moving from problem-focused to solutions-oriented type knowledge, completely in line with the Green Deal and the dynamics embedded in it, and from I would say, fragmented understanding, water pollution, air pollution, soil pollution, all of these things, to more systemic sustainability understanding, also in line with what the Green Deal policies are requesting. So that will be the gist in our SWR 25, which we are starting to produce. Yes, one more slide. That's the last one. Do not despair. All of this, I think, is pointing towards a paradigm shift in policy and science. And this goes back to Kuhn, who talked about the logic of scientific revolutions. Science goes through a paradigm shift when the scientific body and organization is no longer responding to the challenges that it was set up for. And I think we're at that stage now. Fragmentation is no longer what is working. The optimization paradigm, we need to move beyond that. So this is what I think also Executive Vice President Frans Timmermans means when he often says, the system is broke, we need a new system. So if we look at the logic of this, one more existential threats, other language that is in the European Green Deal, rather unusual for EU documents, such strong and clear language. We are dealing with a set of priorities that are not environmental and climate priorities. They are societal priorities, which is where we should come with science that connects the dots. The systemic transitions logic, which I hope I have talked about, the link with sectoral policies, from pollution to efficiency to reinventing yourself, longer time horizons. Science is poorly set up to deal with the future. It's much better at reflecting on the past. The social dimension, which in my opinion is underdefined and underspecified in many ways. It's an easy term, the just transition, but to put it into practice is rather difficult. There's of course a link with innovation and digitalization, not in a naive way. The digital economy is not a panacea, but it can really enable things if we do it well. And at the end of the day, I think Joanna Drake also mentioned that it is a governance agenda. So that is ambitious, innovative, interconnected, and systemic. So the question for science is, are we equally ambitious, innovative, interconnected, and systemic in the responses that we bring and connect to policy processes? Well, thank you.
Thank you very much, Hans, and thank you, Jan, for setting up the scene from both perspectives and connecting us to science and the products of science. Patrick, listening to these presentations, what would be your remarks to kick off our discussion in the panel discussion?
Well, thanks, Veronica, and thanks for inviting me, and thanks for your flexibility about my timing. I apologize, I can't stay for the whole discussion. But I think this is a very sort of timely opportunity as we sort of digest the conclusions of the Sharm el-Sheikh COP on the role of science in supporting policymaking, particularly in the sort of key areas like climate, but also as we're preparing for the Montreal meeting of the COP15 under the Biodiversity Convention. And I'd like just to make sort of three brief remarks, maybe to frame the discussion subsequently. I mean, first, I think that the part of the European Union's global leadership around sustainability issues is very much linked to the input and the contribution that our scientific communities make. And I'm extremely proud personally, also thinking about my background working in digital research and innovation when I was involved, in fact, in the role that Joanna Drake is now doing, that so much of the work of the IPCC, IPBES, and the resource panel that Hans also mentioned, is coming from European scientists who benefit from, in many cases, European financial support from our program, just as the work of the IPCC, IPBES, and the resource panel also benefit from our financial support. So for me, it is a key dimension of what we bring to the global conversation about sustainability, and working with partners like UNEP, who also enrich the work that we're doing in many different ways. And yet, if we look at the results of the COP and the fact that clearly, even with the scientific evidence that is becoming more and more overwhelmingly convincing, we are not yet fully convincing policymakers of the existential threats that we're facing. And particularly if we're looking forward now to the global stocktake, really the crunch moment for the COP next year in Dubai, when I guess it will be the make or break moment for the 1.5 degrees scenario. I think we need to wonder why it is that we're not always having the impact that we should. And I wonder personally whether it's because we as a scientific community not only take very clearly our responsibility to convey the clear and strong messages that we do about the scientific evidence of the challenges that we face, but we also make a big effort to keep hope alive by saying, yes, well, look, we have in our assessment reports, there are all these things, if we don't take urgent action, we're condemned to failure. And yet there is still a scenario which works. And I think that's an important message, but it does, start to, confuse the debate, because then policymakers are facing difficult choices, can say, okay, there is a scenario and someone else will follow it. And so we'll all be safe. And I think we need to find a way of framing the conversation. And the first opportunity we'll have, this is my second remark, is at the biodiversity COP in a few weeks' time. And I really hope that we will be able to sort of recapture some of the optimism around the responses to the threats that we're facing at the COP. And I think what Dr. Liu said earlier about the importance of the links with nature, which is also increasingly clearly coming out of the climate COP discussions, will, I hope, give us things to talk about. And the European Union will be supporting, obviously, an ambitious agenda at the COP, but specifically, we are also working on the establishment of a global knowledge support center for biodiversity, working with Stephen colleagues in the Joint Research Centre, which will, we hope, support enhanced cooperation and collaboration on data, methods and tools at national, regional and global level. So I'm happy to provide more information about that as we go forward. And thirdly, my final remark, and very much echoing the last comments made by Hans on the need for a comprehensive and systemic approach. We have already well-established science for policy-making organizations, the IPCC, IPBES, and the IRP. We are perhaps a gap in our overall sort of architecture in looking at the triple crisis is in relation to pollution. And there, I think that it was very important that the last year's UNEP agreed to launch a new panel on chemicals, waste and pollution, which the European Union very much supported. And we hope that this panel will be ready to be up and running by 2024. And that therefore we will then have a more comprehensive sort of joined up architect to make sure that as we confront these existential threats to humanity, to our planet, that we are increasingly able to harness the best science that we have in the world, including the very strong input from European scientists, but in conversations which get us beyond the sort of shared sense of alarm to the operational search for specific and workable solutions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Patrick. And now we will move to our panel discussion. And I have first apology to make, a very sincere apology to Kurt de Catalere. He is Executive Secretary of League of Research Universities, European Research Universities. I forgot to introduce you with the panelists, so belatedly welcome, and we're looking forward to your contributions on the role of academic institutions. But first, let me turn to Stephen. You are the Director General of Joint Research Centre, but you have many more hats before, executive heads at the European Commission, including taxation, including DG for informatics. But I also learned that you are passionate about communication and links between the interface between technology and policy and science. So, Stephen, can I ask you first to respond on this? What, from your point of view, bearing your current and past experience, what should be the priority for global cooperation in science, research, and innovation?
Yeah, well, thanks. Real pleasure to be with you. And welcome to everyone online as well. It's nice to be joining this discussion. And I mean, I think the opening statements have really set it up very, very beautifully. If I just want to add one, I mean, we've had a lot about this triple planetary crisis, the pollution, the climate change, the biodiversity. What strikes me as well is that this is all happening against the backdrop of a rather challenging time in terms of our multilateral relations, because we've got some quite important geopolitical challenges as well going on. I mean, I was in a foresight conference. One of my many hats is working on foresight, the foresight conference the other week, and we heard talk about paradigm shifts, polycrisis, permacrisis, long-term instability ahead of us. And so, on the one hand, we have to work together more. It's clear that if we don't work together, we can't solve these problems. But working together is likely to be more difficult rather than easier, I would predict, in the months and years ahead. So we've got a real, I mean, this is a super wicked problem in a sense that we have to confront. And I would argue that against that backdrop, scientific cooperation really does provide a possible way of helping to navigate these very challenging waters. Because as we've heard from the previous presentations, there's been a lot of global cooperation going back several decades now, which, even if we think the progress is perhaps not as substantial as we would like, it has helped to pave the way to making the kind of progress and identifying the solutions that we need to be working on. And so I think the first message will be that we have to double down on this scientific cooperation. We need to do more, and we need to do it better, and we need to build better bridges between the world of science and the world of policy. I take Hans's point that science for policy perhaps has some limitations. I shouldn't say this because the Joint Research Centre in the European Commission, our tagline is science for policy. And we believe that this brings great value. But I mean, I agree with Hans that it's not just science and policy, it's also about knowledge and helping to use that science to inform and make action happen at the end of the day. It seems to me that by working together and connecting the scientific community with the world of policy is our best chance of actually having an impact. But I also think it's clear, and this is again implicit in what Hans was saying and the work of the Green Deal here, that we have to be, on the one hand, doing some things quite radically differently if we want to get to where we need to go, but also we need to be doing some quite radically different things. And those two things, I think, are equally valid, and we need to find some acceleration if we're going to make it. Perhaps just two specific thoughts. One is around data. I think that there's more we can do to exploit the power of data and to connect the dots and to find integrated solutions. I think certainly in the Joint Research Centre, we consider ourselves to be excellent on data, but the big effort now is integrating it and connecting it better so that we can see the knock-ons and the tensions and the trade-offs and present those more clearly to the policymakers, so that the tough political choices can be made. And the other thing is investing and working to make the science policy interface more robust. And there we're actually doing some work with our colleagues in digital reform, which is working on improving public administration in the European Union to support member states who want to densify and improve their national science policy ecosystem, to learn from each other, to promote best practice, and hopefully get some of these tough messages into the hands of the policymakers and the decision makers, because I think that's what we need to be investing in. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. We will come back to some aspects later on. Now I would like to bring in one of our online speakers, Kathy Lee. Kathy, you have been following UNFCCC process for quite some time from the gender and youth perspective, and you also negotiated the first seat for youth at the UN Climate Advisory Board. So very happy that we have you here. Kathy, can you tell us from your point of view, from youth, what should be the priorities for science and research?
Thanks, Veronica. And also to start with, would really like to thank the UNEP Secretariat and also the Czech Presidency for putting this forum together. For me, the goal or priority for multilateral cooperation is really about meaningful and equitable youth engagement at all levels. And of course, we can only make progress in multilateralism in the future if we build the capacity of the young people of today. And a few examples at the multinational level, at the multilateral level, I'd really like to see more coherence and also collaborations between UN agencies. For example, the call for stronger climate, biodiversity, nature linkages that many have been calling for, and also of course, we'd love to see stronger youth engagement in science-related processes within various agencies. For example, UNFCCC science negotiation and UNEP Science Business Policy Forum processes. And using the recent COP27 as an example, really great to see their various initiatives like the Youth Pavilion. But of course, we'd also need to ensure that the demands of children and young people need to be considered in negotiations. For example, recognizing their financial needs in the new collective quantified goal, as well as other processes like the global stocktake that Hans mentioned, and really want to see, and I think really great to see the strengthened engagement from IPCC in UNFCCC processes in the past months, and of course looking forward to seeing their work being further integrated across all the thematic work areas. And there have been recent examples like their engagement with the technology mechanism, and also I think focusing more on, but beyond multilateral level, I think at a regional and national level, empowering youth networks are really needed, and also of course financial and technical support for locally youth-led initiatives that are driving changes on the ground. And of course, going back to multilateralism, that making multilateral finance, whether it's from GCF-JEF or whether it's from MDBs, really making sure that they're more accessible for youth and youth-led projects on the ground, and also of course creating more innovative financing options for these youth-led organizations, and also to build their capacity are definitely the key things to really achieve and ensure youth engagement in the multilateral processes.
Kathy, and we will stay online, and I would like to, and I welcome again Radka Vildová. She is holding the position of Deputy Minister for Higher Education, Science and Research at the Czech Ministry of Education, and so on. It's quite a long name. But Radka also previously had capacity of Vice Rector for Education and Strategy at the Charles University, and also Dean of the Faculty of Education. So Radka, you bring the combination of policymaker as well as from academic sector. What from your point of view, what is or should be the role of academic community in strengthening science in decision-making process?
So dear colleagues here, firstly of all, I have to apologize for not a very high standard of camera. I don't really know what's happened, but maybe because of Zoom, I don't really know, but you can hear me, so that's fine, and a little bit see me, that's fine. So Veronica, first of all, I would like to say thank you for the presentation. Both of them were very interesting, and I also thanks very much for this question. This is in fact a very essential and timely topic in the utmost importance for the Czech presidency of a Council of the EU as well. We are looking for the way how to improve the institutionalization of the collaboration and dialogue between scientists and policymakers when it comes to the decision-making process. We must make sure that decision makers have the best possible access to scientific data from the academic community that they can use. We saw it during the pandemic. We have the experience from the pandemic situation, and we saw what was very clear for, I think, all the sciences and all the society, that the integrated approach among the different EU member states regarding their practices and how they use the scientific knowledge and expertise for decision-making was the problem. So to further support the dialogue between the academic community and public administration, we must foster a more coordinated approach in the science for policy ecosystem in Europe, because scientific advice is crucial while translating research data and knowledge into political document, into the political decisions. This is really very important. Luckily, we already have several EU instruments, and you know them, that help us to connect policymaking with specific research, as for such as, for example, that the Recovery and Resilience Plan that includes provisions for better data and evidence use in policymaking. But we must continue with our efforts and reinforcing synergies and networks between policymakers and scientists, including the citizens' engagement in scientific activities as well. What I mean. Thank you.
And we remain now on the academic soil, and again, welcome, Kurt. So Kurt, you have different roles, and I will not even try to summarize it now. But for the purpose of today, you are Secretary General representing the League of European Research Universities. And Kurt, we have had many exchanges on this topic, and I'm sure that you have a lot to add on what we have heard throughout the whole day, actually, so far. But remembering the Leiden principles that LERU adopted earlier this year, there is obviously very strong push from research-intensive universities to contribute to delivering SDGs. Could you tell us what is your view on this, and what could research-intensive universities do even more?
Thank you very much, Veronica, and good morning, everybody. Good to see some familiar faces in the room there in Brussels, among which Hans Bruinings, my former colleague at KU Leuven. Good to see you back, Hans. What I would like to say this morning, also Radka, of course, what I would like to say this morning is that obviously, research-intensive universities like the LERU universities, we are 23 universities in 12 European countries, and we work closely together with a group of 7 universities in Central Europe, among which Charles University in Prague in the Czech Republic. It's clear that, of course, one of our main targets is this global collaboration in order to make sure that through our activities, research, education, innovation, we contribute to solving those societal challenges with which we are confronted, be it on a global scale, be it on a regional scale, be it on a national scale. And it's obvious that our goal is to make sure that we can replicate, for example, what we did with regard to the COVID vaccines, that we also can do that in all kinds of other challenges with which this planet is confronted. In order to be able to do that, we are not only a European network active in Europe, I would say, but LERU also has been the engine since many years behind a global network of research-intensive universities with which we have very similar goals like LERU has and which I just described, in a sense that we have set up a global network of LERU-like organizations worldwide. That is, for example, the Association of American Universities, the Group of 8 in Australia, the C9 in China, etc., etc. And with those networks of research-intensive universities, we try to come together at a regular basis. And you were with us, Veronica, also in Leiden when we met with the different networks to make sure that we can develop joint initiatives which are allowing us to be more effective and efficient in tackling global challenges. And obviously, for many universities out there, there is still a challenge in acting in an interdisciplinary way. But I think that I can be proud to say that certainly the LERU group, together with a number of our sister organizations worldwide, has made it a kind of trademark nowadays that we focus on those global challenges and try to tackle them in an interdisciplinary way. Next to setting up specific research projects together, of course, we also try to develop policy with regard to the involvement of universities in tackling global challenges. And the Leiden statement, the Leiden principles to which you referred are a very clear example of that, and can come back to that later on. But what I want to indicate, and I pick up on what Hans was indicating this morning already, namely that academics are still not talking enough, certainly not directly enough with policymakers. Of course, he's right there, and we see that on a daily basis. Well, organizations like LERU try to remedy that to a certain extent. And for example, LERU is one of the organizations which is part and has signed up to the United Nations Academic Impact, in the sense that we also try to support and contribute to the UN goals in this way. We have consultative status with the United Nations Economic and Social Council, where we also try to participate in policy debates on all kinds of issues which are on the table and which are important for this planet. And also, but I suggest that I come back to that later on in our discussion, we have been the driving force of another initiative, namely the Geneva Science Policy Interface. Through all those initiatives, we try to close the gap as much as possible between the academic world and the political world. But let me finish my first intervention, Veronica, with a worry that I would like to ventilate, and which is not only a worry which is existing in Europe and European Union, but which I see more and more worldwide, namely that there are more and more obstacles created which endanger this multilateralism, this global cooperation between universities worldwide. We see in many parts of the world a kind of politicization of science. And I don't only refer to the EU, the position of the UK and Switzerland in the framework of Horizon Europe, where we have set up this big campaign on stick to science, keep politics and science separated. This morning, you have spoken several times about data and the importance of the exchange of data, but we see in several parts of the world, the European Union, the United States, and not to mention that more and more legislation is adopted which prevents the exchange of data between universities. My own universities in my own group, if you would know what are the problems nowadays in the field of health policy, health research, to exchange data between the EU and the US, this is a nightmare. And finally, the final point that I would like to make, talking about threats to global collaboration between universities, is that I see that in many parts of the world, this notion of strategic autonomy is coming up more and more, not only within the EU, where this so-called open European strategic autonomy is now dominating many debates, but it's quite clear that if the purpose of all those strategies is in different parts of the world to limit collaboration between countries, to limit collaborations between universities in specific countries, and to limit collaboration on specific topics with institutions in countries, that this is, of course, is not going to be helpful to tackle the agendas on biodiversity, climate change, global health, etc., etc. We see in our universities much more issues coming up of foreign interference, export control, military research, limits on free circulation of people, threats to open science, threats to academic freedom and institutional autonomy even. Yesterday, I had the pleasure to speak in the European Parliament, where Roberto Metsola, the chair of the president of the European Parliament, created the European Parliament's Forum on Academic Freedom. Who could ever have thought that such a forum would be needed, certainly within the EU? So it's clear that a number of obstacles are there and are increasing almost on a daily basis, and which are limiting global collaboration between universities.
Thank you very much, and thank you also for pointing out the worry and the obstacles, which I'm sure that we could discuss for another 2 hours. So perhaps we should think of follow-up conference on looking at how can we overcome these obstacles, because this is very, very valid point, of course. But let me now turn to Constance. You are representing European Investment Bank, and you are a lawyer by training, but you have also lots of experience with working with science, and now from the point of view of one of the financial institutions. What, from your point of view, how can science better inform investment decisions to shape the future infrastructure that is needed for sustainable development?
Thank you, Veronica, and thank you also to the Czech Presidency for organizing this event. As you said, I am with the European Investment Bank. We are owned by the EU member states. We, as the EU's climate bank, are really putting the finance behind the EU's Green Deal. We do go to the global capital markets. We have a triple A, and we pass these favorable terms on to our promoters. So you will find us active not only on investment, but also on the funding side. So also on the sustainable finance side of the discussion. We were actually, as the EIB, the first ones to pioneer the climate awareness bonds, the green bonds. And this has also continued to be an important part of our work and of our international work, because capital markets are global. That's why we also consider that it is important to engage with countries where we feel that they have to make an important contribution on common challenges, like China, to work, for example, on common ground taxonomies. We operate globally. We are active in some 160 countries, and we really value the collaboration that we have with the different UN agencies, with the World Bank and other MDBs. The financing infrastructure is a very important part of our portfolio. And a characteristic of infrastructure tends to be that it is a longer term asset. So you better make sure, that you get it right when you make those investment decisions for 20, or 30 or longer years. And that is, also why in 2019, we seriously started our, I would call it, transformation journey as the EU's climate bank by making a number of very significant commitments. And these commitments are very much underpinned by science. They're really, driven by the Paris Agreement and also by the science that has found its way into EU legislation, and that has set important targets. But targets are nothing without implementing and reaching them, and often investment plays a very important role to that. So we made a commitment back in 2019 to no longer finance unabated fossil fuels. We also made a commitment to ensure that 50% of our financing by 2025 would be dedicated to climate and environmental sustainability. And we also made a commitment to fully align our portfolio with Paris, because we didn't want to do green with one hand and do the wrong thing, with the other. We realize that public investment can play a very important role, but the investment gaps, are huge to meet the global challenges, and particularly the climate challenges. So that's why it's critical that we also get the private sector, really along with us. And that is why we said, well, if we get a project, from a company, and they bring the green project, to us, perhaps it's not good enough to only look at the green project, but really look at what the company is doing overall. And that is, why we, with our climate bank roadmap, also introduced this Paris alignment counterparty framework. And that is requiring, from our counterparts to demonstrate that they are embarked on a 2030 and a 2050 decarbonization path. And also for that, we need science again, because to define, those transition paths, to come, to scenarios, to come to systemic thinking about how, getting there. We need science to help sectors, for example, decarbonize. We need, science to push us further, in systems thinking, and that is also why, we are engaging, with our clients and are pushing initiatives like the Science-Based Targets Initiative, so that our clients are looking at that. The other day, I was actually in Prague meeting the Banking Association. They do a lot of the on-lending to the SMEs for us, and to ensure, that also these, local partners can push the green activities to be financed. We actually launched a green gateway, a green checker that will help the local partner banks to identify the activities that as DIB we consider to be green, but which are also EU taxonomy aligned, because it can be quite daunting for our partners to work through the 600-page of the EU taxonomy. But in order, to get there, we know that we need to partner. Inside the EIB, we have, a team in the directorate where I work, a team of some 200 scientists, engineers, etc. And so out of experience, we can also say that we can talk about policy and science finding the same, language. Also, our team inside the house finding the same language with our bankers is sometimes a challenge. But that is why we are also, going through the internal climate trainings to make sure that, our loan officers, when they are talking to our clients, are also actively looking, for those elements that can make a project better from a climate and environmental sustainability aspect. For example, identifying circular economy activities. We also know that we can't have everything inside the house. So that's why, we need to cooperate well, whether it is with the European Space Agency, to take into account, their material, whether it is for our investment projects or for the advisory services that we provide, for example, to the greater Lisbon region to help them prepare for heat waves, in the coming periods. And we don't, stop there. Many years ago, we set up an EIB Institute, and there we have some direct, cooperation as well with the universities on research studies that are helpful as well, to our work. And we actually, a couple of years ago, instituted the EIB Climate Chair at the European University. So let me stop there.
Thank you very much, Constance. And now going to the last panelist, Andrea. What is UNEP's view on the role of science in global cooperation? And second sub-question is, how does UNEP select scientists that we work with? And then we will try to have a second round, a quick one, reflection.
Okay. So clearly, UNEP is a science and evidence-based organisation. I mean, it's actually fundamental to our DNA. It's fundamental to the way that we communicate to different audiences. And I think most people understand that most of the work that we do has that science base. That doesn't mean that we do the research ourselves, however. We are a synthesizing organisation where we take the work of a broad array of global researchers, and we actually synthesize that and hopefully put it in a form that is digestible by a policy audience. With that being said, I want to make a point. I was thinking about the conversation and the need for speed and scaling up our ambition in terms of tackling the triple planetary crises. Scientists are notoriously slow. So are policymakers. Think about your individual areas of activity and you think about how long it takes scientists to decide that, yes, X equals Y or whatever it might be. Policymakers are the same because of the processes they go through. So actually, I do think some of our discussion, we need to talk about how we actually speed up the science and the policy processes. How do we actually get that real-time interface for science into policy. Okay, second part of the question was about how UNEP accesses our scientists. So we as a global convening organisation, we spend a significant amount of time in terms of selecting partners, collaborating centres, individuals based on their expertise to contribute the topics that we're interested in. But part of that requires us to have geographic diversity, gender considerations. And I would also argue that we need to have alternate voices. Just because you have a group of scientists who work on persistent organic pollutants, for example, doesn't mean that they all agree on the science that has actually been published. And one of the interesting processes when you do get a bunch of scientists together is that activity of saying, what do we agree on? What do we disagree on? And what do we need to move? And that's where we bring in that uncertainty, because when you're communicating with policymakers, one of the things that is also concerning where we are, we're really concerned about our future. And as a result, some scientists see that we're not taking enough action. So actually the science is getting lost in the advocacy for the particular issue. And we need to make sure that we maintain the quality of the science so that we're absolutely making it clear to the people who need to use it that what the uncertainty is and then what the options are. So UNEP takes a lot of time actually in selecting its partners, its authors of reports, its reviewers, taking those. We can still do a lot more, and in fact we are certainly trying to do a lot more to ensure that we have good diversity. But we also need to bring in Indigenous knowledge, non-traditional science, and I think from a science framing, that's a very different space as well. And so we've got to learn some new skills about engaging with a broader array of stakeholders in that process. I'll leave it there because I'm sure
Thank you. Thank you very much, Andrea. I know that we are running out of time. We have 10 more minutes to finish, and I'm sure that there are lots of questions in our heads. I have lots of questions for you, panelists, but let me just very quickly run through the panelists. And another question I wanted to ask Stephen is what mechanisms do you think that could be developed to strengthen the global cooperation of science?
Yeah, well, maybe I mean, we are short on time, but I can just rebound on what Andrea was saying there about sort of diversity and alternative voices being needed. And just to give you two very practical examples about ways in which we do this sort of thing in the Joint Research Centre. One example is a town hall model, where we work with UNEP, we work with WHO, we work with national health security agencies and with water utilities. And what we've done in this example is working on how to track COVID-19 using wastewater. And this was something that we did at speed because COVID was an emergency. And we used the town hall model to connect local actors right up to supranational actors. And we used it to explain what we were doing, to exchange rapidly, and to dynamize the community and to get rapid results. So there are examples of how you can sort of quite rapidly go from an idea and a concept to actually scaling and getting results. One other example of how we do this is what we call the Sevilla process. It's called that because one of our sites is based in Seville in Spain. And this is how we determine the norms and the standards for large industrial installations in Europe. And we do it using a process which brings together communities, including industry, but also NGOs, to identify the best available techniques to reduce emissions. And so we have a participatory lawmaking process that brings together science and policy and identifies together what is the consensus about the best available technique, and that then becomes a sort of standard which is then expected to be applied across the piece. So there are ways of actually weaving together science and policy in a way that is intensely practical and implementable. The Sevilla process is perhaps slightly slower than the town hall model, but I think the results are impressive.
Thank you, and thank you for being so concise. Very quick question to Radka. You heard Kathy about youth participation. Do you have any recommendations for all of us? How can we integrate more the voice of youth in the decision-making processes?
Well, the position of a youth is crucial. What we heard in the previous answer, yeah, it is crucial. And to start with, I would like to say that given the current global socio-economic development, it is important now more than ever to pay our attention to supporting the active participation of youth in global scientific cooperation, especially because it is the young generation. And we know that is most at risk from our common pressing global challenge, such as the climate change and the sustainable development of our planet. Having said that, we have to strengthen our approaches aimed at including young people and young scientists in global scientific cooperation, ensuring youth participation in a systematic way. Now, how to do that? Your question was about the process, how to do that. I think we must aim towards increasing efforts in including youth priorities in relevant national and EU policies and including them in decision-making processes, so that their views are taken into account. They must feel it, and it must be a reality of that. It is the vital to take your participation in priority. On top of that, we should look for and support synergies with research and innovation EU programs, but also other related EU programs that target young people and support them in activities that can have a transnational dimension, whether it comes to collaborating in higher education or science and technology. A prerequisite for such action is a strategy that provides young people with enough perspectives, such as education and training opportunities and quality jobs. And I think it is also important to mention that young people play a key role in fostering intergenerational dialogue. Therefore, we must support awareness-raising activities about green and digital transition that are closely linked to young people's lives. If we work together for an active engagement and participation of young people, we can make a right step forward towards a climate-neutral and digital future. That's my answer.
Thank you very much. And Kathy, you heard Constance talking about investments. Your background is very strongly in sustainable finance. Do you have any comments or additional points to raise?
Yeah, I think obviously there's so much that is needed to make sure that multilateral finance is more accessible. And for example, including actions needed by the multilateral funds and also MDBs, and to really make sure they support youth-led and civil society-led organizations and initiatives. And another example is the recently adopted loss and damage finance facility that we needed to be set up in a way that is equitable and also accessible by the most affected countries and communities. And of course, we'd also love to see more collaborations between the funds and organizations to really collaborate and scale up investment for those projects on climate, biodiversity, pollution. An example that I have in mind is the collaboration between the Global Center on Adaptation with AFDB and the Climate Investment Funds on the Youth Adapt project, which has $100,000 grants for 20 youth-led entrepreneurs in Africa every year, which I think is a fabulous example. And of course, we need more initiatives like this. And then last but not the least, circling back to MDBs, that I recently co-authored a report on reform, which includes actions including setting targets for climate finance mobilization, which obviously needs to really strongly link to NDCs of countries, of their beneficiary countries, and also the concrete mechanism that should be in place to track the progress. And also scaling the investment is needed through sharing risk with private finance and to increase risk-related data transparency. And last but not the least, scale up the project development support to scale the pipeline and to ensure that climate finance can be scaled up in pace in a just and equitable way, and especially for civil society stakeholders.
Great, thank you, Kathy. And now we will have super quick question. Just Kurt, do you have any last remark? 1 minute
Yeah, well, talking about impact of what universities can do, I would suggest to all participants that they have a look at the Geneva Science Policy Interface. Just Google that. And there you will see how universities under the lead of the University of Geneva have developed a tool which brings academics and policymakers, primarily those based at the UN institutions in Geneva, together, and where they organize, in fact, a kind of knowledge brokering between academics and policymakers through publications and events. They also try to organize a kind of collaboration brokering in order to make sure that there are matchmaking activities and strategic partnerships developed, also through an impact collaboration program, which is an annual call for specific projects between universities and UN institutions. And finally, also by setting up a kind of field building work in which they try to support and professionalize practices at the science policy interface. And I must say, having been involved in this initiative now for a few years as Leru and as Leru Secretary General, I must say I'm quite impressed by how, in a very practical, spot-on, ad hoc way, bringing together top academics with policymakers in Geneva can lead to fantastic results.
Thank you, Kurt. Stephen, any last remark? Hans, over to you.
Yes, thanks. Interesting debate. I have three really brief remarks. First of all, we referred to the SDGs. I want to remind us that we had SDGs 30 years ago. It was called Agenda 21. And if you reread the text of Stockholm 72, you modernize the language, it's all there. Well-being economics, which is now the new thing, it's in the text. Nature restoration, it's in the text. Justice is in the text. So the knowledge has been there for a long time. So the real question now is, what will we be doing radically different in the next 20 years, which apparently we haven't been doing in the previous 30 years? And that includes a serious reflection on a transition in the knowledge system to plug in knowledge in the transitions. And that's, I think, what Stephen has also referred to. Secondly, I would like, yes, speeding up. We don't understand or focus enough on the logic of speeding up. We understand scaling up much better than speeding up. It requires governance, it requires understanding lock-ins, blockages, and we don't spend a lot of time nor governance efforts on that. So I'm all for it and happy to continue that discussion. And thirdly, in a quick response or tagging on to Stephen's element, I think the JRC was exactly set up to be that science policy interface organization. I mean, you are a scientific organization, but feeding into policy. So it underlines the point that indeed an average scientist, even in a really good research university, top notch, doesn't speak to policymakers. It requires people who are really focusing on that, also in universities. I mean, I come out of one of the research universities. In general, if you are a policy relevant scientist, it's not the best career path in universities necessarily. It's sort of regarded as second rate. I think that's one of the systems that needs to change as well. Working with policymakers or businesses that are part of the solution should not be regarded as second rate to so-called theoretical science. There's good science and bad science in both. And we should value good science and dish the bad science, I would say. Yeah. And I can
only fully support that.
Well, I think we can finish with that, and you, Hans, very nicely concluded the debate, actually. So you made my job very easy. So I will just finish with thanking the panelists and the keynote speakers for a very, very interesting debate. My only regret is that we cannot go on with debating. So I'm sure that there will be part two, and we will try to summarize outcomes in a written document that you will be able to see and work with. So the main idea is that we take away these conclusions and we really work with them in our work. Also, many thanks to the presidency, through which we will also try to distribute the outcomes through the different levels, also from the foreign affairs angle. And thank you for your time. And I'm really sorry that we delayed you a bit. Heads up, tomorrow is day 2. It'll be fully online. It'll be focused on from science to zero pollution actions. So please do join, and then we will wrap all up. So many thanks. and see you next time.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.